Good morning. I'm Kelly Soriano. I'm one of the many members of the Education Committee here at the RVAR that is bringing you this class today, and we are so very excited to have each and every one of you. This is a hybrid class. So we have our folks here, about 35 here in the classroom, and then my understanding is we've got about 50 out in Zoom land. So welcome Zoom land as well. We would like to ask Zoom land that you would stay muted unless you have a question to ask, just so that everyone can hear everything that is going on. For those, we will have time during the presentations for questions. Laura Benjamin is in her office monitoring the Zoom, so she will be asking questions when they come out on the Zoom world, and I'll be helping Neil here in the class. So today's class is being recorded, so you will be able to come back and review it for the next 30 days after the fact. We will also be sending out a survey for you guys' opinions on the class, as well as getting your feedback as to other classes you would like to be seeing having here at RVAR. I also would like to ask you to mark your calendars for two classes that are coming up in December, presented to you by RVAR's Technology Committee. On Wednesday, December 14th, CRS Data, the vendor that integrates tax data into our MLS, will conduct two classes. The 10 a.m. class will focus on searching and the key features of the property report. And the 11:30 class will focus on the CMA options and the prospecting tools. Like our class today, it will be hybrid. So if you're here in person, you can sign up, or you're able to go online and sign up for that class at any time. All right, and now let me introduce the presenter of the day class. It's Neil Holthouser. Neil serves as the coordinator for Appalachian Power Company Shoreline Management Program for the Smith Mountain Pumped Storage Project. That is a mouthful. Neil and his staff, which today is Nick Sink, are responsible for administering the Shoreline's management plan, among other requirements of Appalachian's federal license, in order to protect, enhance the scenic, recreational, and environmental qualities of the hydroelectric project. Prior to joining Appalachian, Neil served as the Director of Planning and Community Development for Franklin County. Please help me welcome Neil.
Thank you and good morning. Good morning. It is great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces. And for all of you on Zoom, I hope that my face is worth looking at this morning. Let's start with a little game. You've heard this before. You say tomato, I say tomato. You say potato, I say. You say Smith Mountain Lake, I say Smith Mountain Pumped Storage Project. Okay, a little vocabulary here. So again, I'm with Appalachian Power. To us, Smith Mountain Lake and Leesville Lake are part of a hydroelectric project that is collectively called the Smith Mountain Pumped Storage Project. I'm going to describe pumped storage to you in a minute. I'll show you some slides that describe how it works. But the key there is, while the community views Smith Mountain Lake, Leesville Lake, certainly as beautiful recreational resources, as very valuable property for economic development purposes, please keep in mind that for Appalachian Power, we invested in this project primarily for the creation of electricity. That is the #1 reason that the lake is there. You probably deal with property owners sometimes who aren't even aware that it's an electric generating facility. I mean, maybe they just think it was a natural lake, I'm not sure. But we get that question sometimes. So I'm going to make sure to cover that this morning. Thank you for entertaining my silly game. So what is the Smith Mountain Project? You'll hear that language from us all the time, the project, the project, the project. It is a federally licensed hydroelectric facility that includes 2 dams and 2 lakes. So here on this map, you will see Smith Mountain Lake, the bigger of the 2 lakes, with Smith Mountain Dam, and Leesville Lake with Leesville Dam, the lower lake. And the key for this, you see the recycling symbol here, is at Smith Mountain Dam, we can pump water from Leesville Lake back up into Smith Mountain. So we're generating electricity at the Smith Mountain Dam when we run water through the dam. Leesville Lake is down below holding that water until such time as we wish to pump it back up and reuse it in Smith Mountain Lake. And of course, we have to release water from Leesville to keep it flowing downstream in the Roanoke River, also known as the Stanton River, before it becomes the Roanoke River again. So this diagram kind of shows you operationally how that works. Water from the upper reservoir, which would be Smith Mountain Lake, passes through turbines at the Smith Mountain Dam to generate electricity. The water is then released into the lower reservoir, Leesville Lake. It can be pumped back for reuse, or we can generate more electricity at Leesville and send the water downstream. Pump storage is a unique thing. You're only going to find a few of these pump storage projects across the country, and this is one of the biggest. It allows us to generate 636 megawatts of electricity, which is approximately 10 times of what a regular run-of-the-river dam could generate. So we can generate a lot of electricity here. The primary purpose of the project is generating electricity. And so for the company, we call that the project use. And for a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, we're going to talk about non-project uses, things not related to generating electricity, but things that support recreation or private development around the lakes. Of course, when we develop the project, it has many benefits for the local community, including public recreation, scenic enjoyment, habitat for fish and wildlife, and it is very important to our local economy for economic development, and we're well aware of that and proud of that. Okay, so some quick trivia here. How much shoreline do you think we're responsible for managing at Smith Mountain and Leesville Lakes combined? Okay, so A 60, B, A 660, or C 600? Correct, C. 600 miles of shoreline. How many properties, individual properties, do you think are adjacent to the lakes? A 120, B 1200, C 12,000 parcels of land. What do you think?
B.
C.
C. 12,000 unique parcels of land front onto this project. If you think about other power plants generating electricity, like a coal plant, you could imagine a fence around the perimeter of the plant, maybe with razor wire on top of it saying, stay out, this is our coal-fired power plant. This is quite the opposite. We have a water-fueled hydroelectric plant with no fence around it and 12,000 neighbors who are immediately adjacent to the project who want to get in the water. Right? So it's very different. How much debris do you think we remove from the lakes every year?
C.
Okay, this is like pick C to win, right? We average 4,000 tons of debris removal. In fact, I can't remember if it was 2021 or 2020. I think it was 2020. We removed 10,000 tons of debris from the lakes.
Both floods.
Yeah, we had 2 significant high water events that year. It's a lot of debris. So why do we do these things? Appalachian Power is responsible for managing various operations and environmental aspects of this project. We do this through a series of management plans. So here's the relationship Appalachian Power has with the federal government, the FERC. This would be the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. So when Appalachian Power wanted to dam a public river, the Roanoke River, as well as the Blackwater River, the Pig River, back in the 1960s, we had to get permission from the federal government to do that because it's a public resource. They're considered navigable rivers. So we're a private company, and essentially we have monopoly of electric generation on what is a public resource, okay, public rivers. So the federal government allowed us to do that under a license, in which case it's like the federal government has deputized Appalachian Power to say, this hydroelectric project is very important to the community. We need the electricity. We need it for the grid. We need it to provide electricity to these rural areas of Southwest Virginia and beyond. So Appalachian, we're happy for you to do this, but along with that comes a lot of responsibility. You're going to have to manage the environment. You're going to have to manage flood control and water levels. And so our license is the vehicle through which we do it. And it's as if the federal government is saying, Appalachian, you're acting in our stead, regulating and enforcing and administering these things. So our license, our federal license, contains a series of management plans. In our office, these are 3-ring binders that deal with various operational topics at the lake, like managing the quality of the water levels. We monitor sediment. We're responsible for the navigation programs within the lake, aquatic vegetation, cultural resources. You might be surprised to know that there are some ancient artifact sites, archaeological sites, some of which were buried under or inundated under the lake, some of which are still along the shoreline. We have to have a plan for how we're going to address those things. Habitat management is very important, both aquatic habitat and upland habitat. We have to have management plans for endangered species, and there are endangered species within our region. We, of course, have a recreation management plan. I just spoke a minute ago to debris management. And then the key thing I'm here to talk to you today about is shoreline management. So the key takeaway there is, under our federal license, we have to have management plans. We do have a management plan for the shoreline management plan. And that's a lot of what I'll cover today. Any questions on that so far? Okay. Let me describe a little bit about the water levels at Smith Mountain Lake and Leesville Lake. And I think this will come up later when you have questions maybe about what we mean by 795 or 800 or these various elevation contours. The first thing to keep in mind is Smith Mountain and Leesville Lakes are part of a much larger watershed that feeds from Virginia all the way down through North Carolina and empties into the Albemarle Sound. So the map you see in front of you is a map of that watershed. Every drop of rain that falls in this area shaded yellow is going to end up in this watershed leading to the Albemarle Sound. And so we are part of a chain of other lakes operated by other utilities as that water is making its way to the ocean. So we have to coordinate with them, and we have to release a certain amount of water to them because we're upstream holding water, but we have to release water downstream to them. Okay, in front of you now are some blown up maps of the Smith Mountain Lake and Leesville Lake watersheds themselves. So on the left-hand side of your screen, shaded in red, is the watershed feeding into Smith Mountain Lake, which is primarily the Roanoke River and the Blackwater River, and then creeks and tributaries feeding into those two. So if you're traveling toward Blacksburg, just before you get to Christiansburg, you're going to come up over a little bit of a pass and then back down into Christiansburg, and that's kind of like a continental divide. The water is going to be shedding to the east of that into the Roanoke River drainage basin, and to the west of that, that's in the New River watershed, and all that water is traveling north to the Ohio River, to the Mississippi, to the Gulf of Mexico. So geographically, it's a pretty interesting place that we're in. Okay, so water comes into the project, water leaves the project. On average, we have about 650 cubic feet per second of water entering the project. And when the project is balanced, we're releasing 650 cubic feet per second at Leesville Dam downstream. There are times when there's more water coming into the project than we're releasing. There are times that are probably frustrating for property owners when we're releasing more water than is coming in, and therefore the water levels are dropping. Our goal is to have that balanced. Inflow equals outflow. So again, the way we manage lake levels at Smith Mountain and Leesville Lake, we can do this by pumping water back up into Smith Mountain. Smith Mountain Lake is a much bigger lake. It's a bigger bathtub. Leesville is a smaller bathtub. Under normal operating procedures, we would use what we call a 2-foot power pool in Smith Mountain Lake. So if we start at full pond, and I'll describe this in a minute, 795 feet elevation, and we're generating power, we might draw that lake down to 793. That 2 feet of water in Smith Mountain Lake, when it lands in Leesville, is a 13-foot increase in Leesville Lake. So if you lived at Leesville Lake, you're going to experience much more dramatic changes in water level than you do at Smith Mountain. And then, of course, we can turn that in reverse, and that 13 feet of water in Leesville is available for us to pump back, creating 2 additional feet in Smith Mountain. So that's kind of theoretically how that works. I think this will give you a little better illustration. This is a photograph on the left of the spillway. There are 2 spillways in the Smith Mountain Dam. The Smith Mountain Dam was designed in the late 1950s, early 1960s It was constructed throughout the early 1960s, and by 1966, we reached full pond at Smith Mountain Lake. Okay, so our engineers designed and our builders built that dam with concrete spillways set at 795 feet elevation above sea level. So if you were standing in this photograph right on top of that spillway, you were standing at 795 feet above sea level. So if the water is brimming right up to that spillway, then it stands to reason that the surface of the lake at Smith Mountain Lake is 795 feet above sea level. Make sense? That would be full pond. Lake is full all the way up to the spillway of the dam. Now, if there's enough inflow into the project, enough rainfall, the creeks are swelling, and enough water is coming into Smith Mountain Lake, in your mind's eye, I want you to picture 1 foot of water overtopping the spillway of the dam. You can probably picture that, right? 1 vertical foot of water going over the spillway of the dam. All right, here's a math quiz. What's the surface of the lake up to at that point? If it was 795 at the spillway, there's 1 foot of water going over it. That brings the surface of the lake up to 796. Okay. If 2 feet of water are going over the spillway of the dam, that brings the lake level up to 797. And we designed the project for 5 vertical feet of water going over the spillway of the dam. Seems a little bit harder to imagine, but that's like a 5-foot wall of water going over the spillway of the dam. That would bring the surface of the lake up to 800 feet elevation above sea level. And that is what we planned for when we built the project and secured the rights to flood the surrounding area. So when you work with us, you'll hear that 795 number a lot. Okay, that's the shoreline of the lake or the base elevation. But then you hear about this other number, the 800-foot elevation at Smith Mountain Lake. It's because that is our capacity that we would need to store water in the event of a flood that we're creating a 5-foot discharge over the spillway of the dam. It can get higher than 800. According to FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, the 100-year floodplain at Smith Mountain Lake is like 802.2, but it has never gotten that high. It could get that high, but it's actually never exceeded 800. We've had 3 events, I think, 2 of which occurred in 2020 that brought the lake as high as 799, but we have never surpassed 800.
Question.
Yes.
So is the typical surface of the lake, do you keep it at 795? And when you pump out the 2, it's at 793, or do you keep it at a different level?
So it's hard to ever say that it's kept anywhere. It's in flux all the time. There's always inflow coming in. There's always outflow going out. So 795 operationally is the sweet spot. That's where we'd like it to be. That means that we have full capacity to generate power. But it really is going to depend on weather patterns and inflow and outflow. You know, I think most of you would agree that Appalachian has a pretty good track record of keeping it between that 795, 793. And when we're working with property owners to plan their boat docks, we're working kind of under that notion that that's about where you're going to find the water when you're trying to get your boat in the water. 795, 793. Yes, ma'am.
Neil, can I suggest there's a great site, smithmountainlakelevel.com, and you can see the lake levels historically, right?
That's right.
So that's a great little website to go to see where the lake levels are for that day, right?
So we were just citing in the name for this website again, we're pointing, for those of you who couldn't hear, we're pointing to a website that publishes lake levels, and you were mentioning Smith Mountain.
It's smithmountainlakelevel.com.
smithmountainlakelevel.com. We also, on our website that we host at Appalachian Power, smithmountainproject.com.
Okay.
The front page of that website will have current lake levels as well. Again, that would be smithmountainproject.com. So back to that 800 number, at Leesville Lake, I don't know how many of you are doing work in real estate at Leesville Lake, but I do need to speak to this. Leesville Lake is lower than Smith Mountain Lake. Leesville fluctuates generally between 600 feet elevation and 613. That 13 feet of water is equivalent to the 2 feet of water in Smith Mountain Lake. But our project boundary is the 620 contour at Leesville Lake, which means we need up to 620 as capacity to hold water in the event of a flood at Leesville Lake. So there's a lot of things we have to balance here with lake levels. The biggest thing really is the demand for energy. Keep in mind, there's only two ways for water to get from Smith Mountain Lake to Leesville Lake. It can either go over the spillway of the dam if we're above 795, or if that water passes through the dam, it has to run through turbines, which are generating electricity. So that electricity has to go somewhere, it has to be consumed, it's going to the grid. So we are always monitoring what the demand is on the market for electricity. If we're going to run the turbines, there needs to be a use for that electricity on the grid. Of course, we're taking into account existing lake levels, before a storm event. We're monitoring forecasts constantly, looking for inflows both into Smith Mountain Lake, but separately there are inflows into Leesville Lake. They're both kind of filling up at the same time with different inputs. We're looking at what the forecast is downstream of our project. Showed you that original map going all the way to the Albemarle Sound. We need to know if those lakes are going to flood down below us. There are river gauges all up and down the Roanoke River, the Stanton River that we're watching. But our primary goal in any water management event is public safety. So we're trying to balance all of these water flows with public safety. We get calls very frequently from homeowners saying, I have company coming in this weekend. Can't you get the water level up where it would be, right? It's important. It is important, but it's not that easy. I think most of you would agree that we're remarkably consistent, particularly at Smith Mountain Lake, with having enjoyable water levels at most times. Okay, I want to get back to our management responsibilities. I spoke about all these various management plans, but I do want to get to the Shoreline Management Plan, which is the primary reason I think I'm here today. If you go back to about the year 2000, many of you who were in business prior to that time will remember you didn't come to Appalachian Power for permitting for single family docks. You would go to your county building departments and pull a building permit. Okay, many of you remember those times?
Yes.
Okay. So the counties might have done things a little bit differently. There may not have been absolute consistency across all the counties in terms of what they were requiring. And it was also probably true that structures were being built that might have infringed on neighbors somewhat. I mean, it wasn't altogether uncommon for someone to go to build a dock in front of their property and say, I really don't want to block my view. Let me slide my dock over here and I'll build it there. And then the neighbor comes along a few years later to build and says, why is there a dock in front of my property? So the Shoreline Management Plan came about in part to promote consistency and fairness. And again, it was a mandate by the FERC. The FERC said, Appalachian Power, you need a management program, you need a permitting program for these, quote, non-project use structures in your reservoir. And again, non-project use, the opposite of non-project use is project use, which is generate electricity. So the motivating factor for Appalachian Power is we need to hang on to our ability to have the project use, make electricity, at the same time that we're allowing these non-project uses, which is private recreation. So we began a permitting program in about the year 2000 for single family docks. Okay. And these permits were called non-commercial boat dock pier landing permits. We didn't issue many of them, and they weren't very detailed, but some of you have probably come across that language. Have you seen that? So this was an early generation of permits. It was in the year 2003 when we implemented our Shoreline Management Plan. Again, a requirement from the federal government, a requirement from FERC that we adopt this plan and begin the modern permitting program. That began in August of 2003. So we have some permitting history pre-2003, but the modern era really began in August of 2003 for permitting of structures. Once we launched the Shoreline Management Plan in 2003, we recognized that there were some grandfathered structures in the lakes, and we wanted to address those and to recognize them and to give them a status. So we kept a window open through September of 2005, whereby property owners could submit documentation to the company to document what they have with photographs and drawings or maps of their existing dock that we could keep as a baseline of information to say, got it, we understand that structure was there, it predates the Shoreline Management Plan, you can keep it, you can maintain it, And that documentation is helpful to us going forward. So we're now 19 years later, and we have file drawers full of this documentation. We call it existing non-conforming structure documentation, ENCS. Does that ring a bell? Okay. So often when you're getting reports from Appalachian Power, we will say ENCS documentation was submitted by the property owner in 2004. We're comparing existing conditions today to what it might have looked like then. Everything checks out. It's the same as it was. You're still grandfathered. Thank you. Or the dock is different than it was when it was documented in 2004. Something has changed. That change needs to be addressed. Let's ask you to get a permit to address the change that was made. Does that sound familiar? Okay. So 2003 is when we implemented the Shoreline Management Plan. It was most recently updated in 2014. So the version of the plan that we're using today dates from January of 2014. How did I draw that? What did I do? I'm up here waving my arms and I drew a red circle. Interesting. Okay, let me talk to you about our permitting program, the types of permits that we issue, how you go about obtaining them, and I want to reserve the bulk of the time to talk about, I think, what is probably most particular to what you do, our status of property program. So let me first describe the types of permits we issue. I also want to mention that we have a shoreline management program for Claytor Lake in Pulaski County. For any of you who are doing work in Pulaski County, it's going to be a very similar situation there. It has its own shoreline management plan. Of course, there are different elevation numbers there. So 795, 800 are not the numbers at Claytor Lake. But we do have a sister program at Claytor Lake, very similar to Smith Mountain and Leesville. Okay, so at Smith Mountain Lake, if our project boundary is the 800-foot elevation contour, if you're a property owner and you walked out your back door, you're walking down your backyard to the lake. I can see the lake down there. That looks like that's where Appalachian's purview is, where the water starts. But at some point as you're walking down your yard, you're going to trip across an imaginary line at an 800-foot elevation contour where Appalachian's purview starts. And the way you have to kind of reverse engineer it is think about, in a flood event up to 800, where would that water come? Like a ring around a bathtub. If you drain the bathtub, it would leave a ring at 800 feet elevation. That's where our purview begins. So on a very steep property, that 800-foot elevation is going to be right there at the top of the bank. It's not going to be very far from the 795 because the property is really steep. The water raises 5 feet. It just hits the top of the bank. I hope that translate on Zoom. Mm-hmm. On a very flat or shallow property, that 800-foot elevation contour could be well up into your backyard. So one of the big pieces of advice we would give to property owners is know where your 800-foot contour is. If you've ever had a survey done and it's been staked, keep those monuments there. Make sure you know where your 800 is. We often, the first thing we have to do when we're meeting with property owners is explain to them this whole thing about why the 800 is an important number and how to find your 800. Anything that you want to do above that project boundary, above the 800-foot contour at Smith Mountain or above the 620 at Leesville, is outside of Appalachian's purview. You want to build a structure, you want to clear the land, you want to do grading work or any of that. If you're above the project boundary, you do not require permitting from Appalachian. But once you trip over that line and get below the 800 at Smith Mountain or below the 620 at Leesville, then you're now part of the hydroelectric project and you would need permissions from Appalachian Power. Okay. So the types of permits we issue, the obvious one would be for structures like docks, a dock, a pier. Okay. And so the name of the permit that we issue for those structures is called an occupancy and use permit. Most of you have seen these. They're pretty gray documents with a lot of legalese in them, whereas, now, therefore, with a bunch of conditions developed by attorneys, because it does act like a contract between the company and the property owner saying, we agree that you're going to have a structure located within our hydroelectric project boundary, and you're going to be using this structure, and here are the terms of agreement between the company and the property owner for how that structure is going to be built and how it's going to be used. Occupancy and use, here's what that means. That structure is occupying and using a space. that if it were not there, would otherwise be available to the general public for boating and swimming and kayaking and fishing, because all of the waters of the lakes are considered public waters. So if you did not have a dock there, someone else would be free to swim there or kayak there or boat there, fish there. But when you have a dock and you're under a permit, the property owner can say, I have exclusive privilege from Appalachian Power to use and occupy this space and exactly this space for my personal and private recreational needs. That's what we're doing. And you might be surprised to know that we're happy to do that. We don't reluctantly give permission to occupy and use space. We recognize that that's of benefit to the community, certainly desired, and private recreation is something that we plan for, anticipate, and we encourage. So we want property owners to be able to enjoy their property by occupying and using space. But what we ask them to do is abide by the terms and conditions of their permit. So if you tell us this is the dock you're going to build, please build that dock. Okay. I'll get into that in a minute when we start talking about status of property reports, kind of this wellness check, but how often we find that the docks do not match what's been permitted and some of the reasons why, much of which could be attributable to education, and hopefully we're solving some of that problem today with some education. Another type of permit we issue is called a shoreline stabilization permit. So where the shoreline is actively eroding due to wave action or stormwater runoff, then we can permit a property owner to combat that active erosion by putting in some kind of a technique to stabilize the shoreline. Most often that's in the form of riprap. So if you go back prior to 2003, you're going to find a lot of properties that had shoreline with riprap, which is now failing. It's sloughing off into the lake. The stones have tumbled down into the lake. It's not working properly. That is possibly because it wasn't installed properly. Under today's standards, to get a permit for shoreline stabilization, you would supply us drawings that would tell us what the slope is, the length of shoreline that you're trying to stabilize. And we have certain requirements for what we call a buried toe. Think of it like a footing and a foundation, something that's going to scotch the weight of that stone that wants to slough down into the water. It's going to hold it in place. Filter fabric. Filter fabric is going to prevent soil from eroding through the riprap. Most of you have probably seen mud-stained riprap at the lakes. And you might think that that's due to the water being muddy and it's stained the riprap. It's actually from sediment, that red Franklin County, Bedford County clay behind the riprap, pulling through the riprap with wave action, water action, pulling it through and then out into the lake. So filter fabric is meant to prevent that action of pulling that soil back through the riprap. Another type of permit that we issue is a vegetation removal permit for the removal of trees and shrubs and bushes. And we probably need to spend a lot of time on that this morning. It's probably one of your biggest head shakers you have. But here's my setup for why we do it. Because we have no control outside our project boundary, because we're not regulating development above the 800 at Smith Mountain or above the 620 at Leesville, property owners can clear their entire property down to the 800. Now, when they've cleared natural vegetation and are resculpting the land in order to build a house, they're changing all the characteristics of stormwater runoff for their property. They're increasing the amount of stormwater that's running off toward the lake. Our project boundary, that distance between the 800 and the 795, or between the 620 and the 613 at Leesville, is like a ribbon of land, a buffer that intercepts that stormwater runoff. It's meant to filter that water, cleanse that water, and make sure that sediment is not getting into the lake. And the best defense against that is vegetation. Vegetation has root zone, which is stabilizing the soil. Okay, vegetation is soaking up water, right? Uptake of water through the roots. Vegetation is filtering out things like phosphorus and nitrogen. The very things that you're adding to your lawn through fertilizers, your trees and your shrubs are going to be picking up and not allowing into the lake. Left unchecked, those are the things that lead to algae blooms and can affect water quality. Vegetation provides important habitat for wildlife. Vegetation is pretty good against guarding against geese nesting in your bare lawn. Geese like to find runways, right? Cleared land. Vegetation is very important for the fish habitat. The trees that overhang the water, the edge of the water, are shading that water. Twigs and branches break off and fall in the water. They create hiding places for fish. Little insects and spiders fall from those trees the fish are feeding on. So if you fast forward to a day when the lake was entirely developed and all of that native vegetation is gone, and if all you had were manicured lawns down to riprap shoreline, you'd have a very sterile lake. It wouldn't be very healthy. So we are under a mandate to, through our shoreline management plan, it's an expectation from the FERC that we're managing that vegetative buffer in a way that will provide that wildlife habitat and keep the root zone to stabilize the soil. We do issue permits that allow you to selectively remove vegetation, but there are requirements that you have to replace the function of the buffer by planting back. Question?
So anything in the project boundary, do you get requests to limb up, let's say to open up a view?
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the question is, do we allow limbing up or thinning of vegetation? And we do. You can limb trees up. I believe the shoreline management plan says up to 14 feet in height, but you have to be careful not to so reduce the canopy of that tree. And I believe that's a 20% rule. You can't reduce the canopy of the tree by 20%, which is not an exact science. It's a little bit of a judgment call, but surely, yeah, you can limb up so that you can get view penetration underneath. Here's the difficult thing. People who want to take trees out to open up view or to get rid of dead, dying, or diseased trees, or maybe to build their walkway to get down to their dock, or maybe even to install the riprap along the shoreline, will find that there's mitigation required that you have to plant back. Right? Then it becomes difficult to find the alternative location on your property. Where am I going to plant back? And then you have to be thinking ahead, what you're planting back is going to mature and become a bigger tree someday. Right? So it's a trick to try to manage and balance that. What we're looking at is to preserve the function of that vegetative buffer. We'll work with property owners who want to get creative and strategic about it, but the expectation should never be, I want a clear-cut property with open views to the water. I get it, however. If you go to the lake, you will see other properties that have that very feature. So property owner might look and say, I want what he or she has. And under today's rules, you can't achieve that. So some people do have clear-cut lots, but going forward, since we implemented the shoreline management plan in 2003, that should not be the expectation.
I have one more question. If, let's say we had this happen, a tree, dead tree falls into the lake. So we call you all, do you have to come out? Do we have to get permission to remove that tree? Because obviously it's sort of been our neighbors when they're trying to get their boat out kind of thing. So do I have to get a permit to remove the tree?
Sure. So the question again is, if there's a dead tree on the property, it's either leaning, it hasn't fallen yet, or it has just fallen, do you need a permit from Appalachian Power? And what's the sequence of events? And the answer is yes, you do need permitting, but if it is endangering people or property, we don't want you to wait on our permit. We want you to document it, photo document, take some measurements. Don't just take one picture, try to photo from a couple different angles so we can really get a picture of what was there. But we don't want anyone getting hurt or any property damaged. If you're in a pinch and you need to get that out, you can,
Okay.
and we'll work with you retroactively on permitting. Okay, so I've gone over occupancy and use permits for structures that are occupying and using space, like a contract between company and the property owner. Shoreline stabilization permits for active erosion, vegetation removal permits, dredging permits is another thing. Okay, and you can only dredge sediment. You can't go in and scoop out the hard bottom of the lake in order to create a new channel or a new deep spot for a dock. But you can get permission to remove accumulated sediment. And there's a threshold there of 25 cubic yards, which is about the size of one of those roll-off dumpsters. If you were doing a home renovation project and you brought in this big long rectangular box dumpsters to your house, right? That's about 30 cubic yards, 25 cubic yards. So that amount of sediment does not require a permit from Appalachian Power. Above 25 cubic yards, which is probably what you'd need to dredge if you're trying to get out to deeper water. So not just your boat slip, but you're trying to get, a lane to get out to deeper water is probably more than 25. That would require a permit from Appalachian. Permitting is also required from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We try to work closely with them to help you get their take on it. But ultimately, you are looking at going to two agencies for dredging, Corps of Engineers and Appalachian. Kelly,
Neil, we
question?
have a question from Zoom land. Laura?
Thank you.
Hey, Neil, it's Laura Benjamin. I actually now have two questions.
Okay,
This is going back to trees and debris and what can be removed. Still don't quite understand why a property owner cannot remove a dead tree from the lake.
okay. Is that question related to a tree that's in the water, that's fallen into the water, or just fallen on
Yes,
land?
yes, that's on from their property that's fallen into the lake.
Okay, so it's not accurate to say that they cannot remove a tree from the water, but it is going to depend. It's going to depend on how big and where it's located. If humans did not live at Smith Mountain Lake and trees were falling into the water all the time, that's kind of what nature does, and it's terrific habitat for fish. I mean, it's a good environmental thing. However, it's not attractive for property owners. I get that. But it also could interfere with property owners who are trying to navigate to gain access to their dock. So we're going to look situationally, case by case, at the context of what's happening around that fallen tree in the lake. And if it's on wild shoreline, undeveloped, our default position is let's leave it there. It's functioning, it's doing its job as fish habitat. If it's in a fairly well-developed shoreline, most residential subdivisions where docks are spaced 100 feet apart or less, we're more than likely going to say, yes, you may take that out. It's going to interfere with kids swimming, access to your dock, trying to navigate around your docks. So we're probably going to allow that to be taken out. Now, we may require mitigation, which is as you take it out, let's take the limbs from that tree, let's bundle them up and sink them somewhere in the lake to create fish habitat instead of the tree and the trunk being there. Or property owner, if you'd like to invest in some artificial habitat, and there's some great products on the market today to do that. We might work with a property owner to do that. Laura, did that answer your question?
Well, I'm sure it did. Thank you. One more question.
Okay.
How about the olive bushes that are growing wild on many properties along the lake and are considered an invasive species by the Smith Mountain Lake State Park? Can a property owner cut this down, or do they still need permission?
So we group invasive species, Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, in the same category with dead, dying, or diseased trees. They are, long story short, we do require replacement rates, but at half the rate we would for a healthy, thriving native tree or vegetation. So we would work with property owners to remove any invasive species, and the rate of replacement is significantly less than it would be if it were a native tree being removed. That gets us into things like bamboo and pampas grass. Correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, but we don't require any mitigation or replacement for bamboo or pampas grass. We need that out, but that stuff is so invasive that some of the only way to get it from growing back is to actually burn it. And the thing that we ask property owners to do there is to make sure that they are restoring the ground itself so that it doesn't lead to erosion. So we might work with them on a shoreline stabilization permit when they're removing big groves of bamboo or pampas grass to see how they're going to repair the land itself to make sure that it doesn't erode.
Is the pampas grass considered good for erosion control or bad?
Well, it's not native,
Right.
and we don't regulate it to say you cannot plant it. If people have it and wish to remove it, we will certainly allow them to remove it, but we're not requiring its removal. What we find over time is just that it gets so big and out of control that a lot of property owners get tired of it and want to remove it. And we'll work with them to do that. But we are not in a posture of telling anybody that they cannot plant something. So if someone affirmatively wants to plant something in our project boundary, we're not saying, no, don't plant that. You're not allowed to plant that. Our purview really kicks in when it's a proposal to remove it, not when it's affirmatively being placed.
Okay, I have one more follow-up question, Neil, from Zoom land.
Okay.
Can you share a general idea of how often you decline a request to remove trees, either live or dead? Perception is that you deny more than you approve, but that may not be reality.
That's a very good question, and thank you. So let me start with what our intent is, what we're trying to accomplish. We are looking at the function of the current vegetative buffer. How much tree canopy is there? How much understory is there? How much ground cover is there? And our starting point is we'd like to preserve that. So whatever we come out on the backside of a vegetation removal permit with, we hope to have an equivalent value. So if we're going to reduce canopy by X, we want to replace canopy by X. Now that canopy replacement isn't going to be X at the moment of planting. It's designed to grow into X. So for example, if you're going to remove a 12-inch diameter tree that's got a very big canopy associated with it, the trees that we're going to require you to plant back aren't going to have nearly that big of a canopy, but they're designed to mature into that level of canopy. So back to Laura, back to your question. It is probably a high percentage of vegetation removal permits where the property owner is going to leave feeling like they didn't get their request approved. They're probably going to get some or a lot of their request approved, but maybe not 100% of what they'd asked for. And that's because the expectation coming into the permit might have been different from their expectation after we worked with them a little bit to understand the function of the buffer and what is actually allowable. So I am sure that most people would feel like vegetation permitting doesn't get them 100% of their goal of what they would like to do from the genesis of their, wish. But I think outright denial of vegetation permits of no, sorry, you can't remove anything is extremely rare. We normally will find ways to work with people to help them accomplish their programmatic goal. And we're asking them to work with us in trying to maintain the function of the buffer.
Thank you. And now I have one more question from Zoom land. Once we got going, why will you allow mulch on the shoreline area between 800 and 795, but the homeowner cannot use river rock?
Right.
The mulch will wash into the lake and the river rock will not. So
that's another very good question. So on a micro level, property by property, the amount of fill material from rock or stone or even dirt doesn't seem like much. Like really, I mean, am I really affecting the capacity of this big bathtub with just this little amount of fill I'm doing on my property? But we have to look at it cumulatively around all properties at the lake. And so we don't want fill material going in that's going to change the shape or the size of the bathtub, our capacity for managing this water. So the rock that you use for riprap is going to be class 1 stone. Class 1 stones are probably at least 50 pounds, isn't that right? 50 to 150 pounds each. They're not going to just wash into the lake. They're going to tend to stay put. But the kind of landscape stone or gravel that a lot of people wish to apply is going to wash into the lake. It's going to find its way into the bottom of the lake. It is reducing the capacity of the lake, and the likelihood of that ever coming out is next to nothing. No one's going to go and rake it out or fish it out. So over time, cumulatively, that kind of rock is just going to keep adding fill to the lake. Mulch, however, is biodegradable, okay? And mulch will not fill in the lake. And in fact, mulch actually is helpful in the lake to the nutrient balance in the lake. And Nick, help me out a little bit on this one. You're more of a scientist when it comes to the nutrient cycle.
Yeah, so
And I'll repeat this for Zoom.
it makes nitrates available to microbes as well. So it prevents some of that from getting to the lake. Not as much as vegetation, but it does help with that. It also helps retain moisture. And it provides a substrate for vegetation to grow in, which I know isn't necessarily the goal, but it does help with that as well.
Okay, so if you couldn't hear my colleague Nick Sink, his scientific explanation, I won't try to repeat all of it, but science says mulch good. Does that work? Okay. But that's a great question, because to the property owner, you think it's material, they're both going in the lake. Why would you prefer one or the other? Yes, sir.
Ballpark timeframes, if you provide everything that is necessary, timeframe for various permits.
Thank you. The question is timeframe. How long does it take to get permitting from Appalachian? The first answer is we wish it were a lot quicker than it is. Okay. We understand that it can be very frustrating to wait on permitting. We understand that it can affect real estate closings, that you're trying to get all of your, and that you have more to do than just chase Appalachian permits. You've got a much busier job than just working with Appalachian to get to closing. I promise you we have these conversations in the office all the time. So I will try to answer your question. This isn't a dodge, but it kind of depends on what type of permit and the reason that the permit is needed. So let me start with outside of the real estate transaction process, somebody who owns a property, they're not buying or selling the property, they just come to us and they say, well, I want to build a dock or modify a dock. The first thing we're going to, hopefully that they've submitted a complete application to us. We have all the documents that we need. We're going to review those documents for completeness. We're going to check the file to see what we've permitted in the past as kind of a baseline information. This is our expectation of what the property should look like based on the previous times we visited the property. Then we're going to schedule a site inspection, and you can imagine it might be a week or two between receiving the application and coordinating that time to get out in the field and inspect. That probably seems reasonable, depends on manpower and weather and workload, but we try to pretty quickly get out in the field to do our inspection. If we come back from that inspection and everything checks out, the property is exactly what we expected it to be. Everything matches from previous permits, and the drawings we have in front of us are all legible and they meet the shoreline management plan, then we're pretty close to the finish line. Really it's kind of bureaucracy from that point forward to collect the signatures that we need and to collate the document and get it scanned and sent out. So we're not far from approval at that point. Unfortunately, that's pretty rare that we get an application that's complete, has all the documentation that we need, we inspect the site and everything checks out the way we thought it would. So here's where it starts to break down. The documents aren't correct to begin with. We're kind of an iterative loop back and forth with the property owner. Please amend this. Please make this change to your application. This doesn't work. Another would be we visit the site, we do an inspection, and it's not what we expected to see. There's something else that needs to be addressed, either related to the dock or just related to the land within the project boundary. And then we're trying to correct those things next, which often leads to the need for another permit for vegetation removal before we can get back to reviewing the dock. The key thing is, to the property owner, that feels like this process took me from the moment I submitted that first application. That's when their clock is ticking. And I get that. I understand that. But from our standpoint, we kind of feel like it's resetting every time we're needing different information, correct your application, fix this problem that you had on the property. So those can be many weeks or months. And unfortunately, we've had some of those files that we're still working on. If the property owner is not readily complying, then
You're stuck.
we're stuck. Yeah.
Can you speak to, that's a great question on the time frame, but can you speak on it? Maybe a better way of going about it is to get a dock builder, possibly that's going to be building your dock, to submit the drawings, and because they know more about what is required, and that might make the process easier.
So I want to make sure everyone on Zoom hears these questions. The last question we're answering were turnaround times for permitting, and this really is about professional expertise helping property owners
Exactly.
get their applications correct, whether it's a dock builder, a surveyor, et cetera.
Exactly.
This is a great time for me to brag on you and our wonderful contractors and builders and surveyors. Guys, we have a community of incredibly talented people working at Smith Mountain and Leesville Lake. Many of you have been doing what you've been doing pre-shoreline management plan, right? There's an industry of dock builders and surveyors and realtors all working in concert. Who you're all really good at what you do, and you're very helpful to your property owners. So the first thing I would advise a property owner is don't do it by yourself. Take advantage of your realtors, take advantage of your dock builders and your surveyors. They do know what they're doing. That's very helpful. We implemented about 5 years ago a new requirement in permitting for a survey. So it used to be that we would get hand-drawn drawings of docks, graph paper, cocktail napkins, sketches, and we would use those for the permitting. And it was very likely that you would go in the field to do an inspection and nothing would match that drawing because it wasn't professionally drawn. In 2017, we began a requirement that you have to have a survey to get a dock permit. Now, let me back up. If you're modifying an existing dock and you already had a survey and a permit for the last time you built it or modified it, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, you don't have to get it resurveyed today. You can use that baseline of your original survey and kind of have that amended to show your next improvement to your dock. So it's not like every time you talk to us, you're getting a permit. But the goal is, over time, everybody should have a survey as a baseline of information for permitting. This did a couple of things. And actually, this suggestion came to us from dock builders themselves. I can remember this was in 2015, 16, 17, meeting with dock builders. And they said, Appalachian, your queue of permitting is bogged down with speculative docks. Call them ghost docks. Property owners who were seeking a permit for a dock that they had no intention to build, but only to prove to a buyer, hey, I can get a permit for it. And if you want to buy my property, I've already secured a permit for a dock. The buyer had no intention to build that dock. Okay. They just wanted proof that it was, they called it dockable, right? So a lot of our energy went into reviewing those permits that were never going to materialize in a dock. And so the contractor said, you know, a lot of those permits just aren't very good. They're not drawn very well. If you had a survey requirement, we think you would get better permitting, and it would create a little bit of a barrier to the speculative dock phenomenon. And it has. So beginning in 2017, we implemented that requirement. We're now getting really, really good information from our property owners. It's far more legible to us. And when we go do a site inspection, it's a whole lot easier to compare, you know, apple to apple. Here's what's on the plan. Here's what we found in the field, and everything checks out. Kelly.
Got another one in Zoom land.
Okay.
Okay, here's the latest question. When a dock is considered deep water, could you clarify how deep is deep water?
Thank you. So keep in mind, 795 is what most people call full pond. Our requirement in the shoreline management plan at Smith Mountain Lake is that you must have 4 feet of water depth under your boat slip for any new slip being created today. There are plenty of grandfathered slips out there that are not that deep and they can keep them. But if you're planning for a slip today, you should have 4 feet of depth. That means that the lake is at 791 at least at the bow of your boat when you park in your slip. If we're operating, you know, generating energy at the dam and lowering that lake level from 795, say down to 793, that ensures that you still have at least 2 feet of water under your boat. And even then, we can't guarantee that we stop at 793. Sometimes it can get lower than that. But you can see that it would not be wise to have a boat slip with less than 4 feet of water depth, because of the way we operate the lake, you just don't want your boat resting on the ground. So the modern requirement is 4 feet for a boat, 3 feet of water for a personal watercraft, PWC.
So does that mean that if the elevation, if all the water's out of the lake, say it's a low tide, and you can prove that the elevation is 791 at the mud or the dirt, then that counts as 4 foot, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
All right, so thank you, Adam. It was basically a thought exercise that if you drain the lake down 4 feet, 791 would be the shoreline at that point. It'd be muddy. But that's the point at which you need to get to. When the,
Can't measure, you know,
right,
so.
right. So we require that the surveyors provide that information as part of their applications. They'll tell us where the 791 is located. They can find that. Okay. How's Zoom world doing out there?
I have
Okay,
another
good.
question. I have another question for you. Can you have a 6-foot path to the dock?
Yes. You can.
Thank you.
It should be limited to 6 foot in width. So what we're trying to accomplish here is to minimize the impact to that vegetative buffer. Now, I know this runs counter to what a lot of property owners want, but in your mind's eye, if you envision a very densely vegetated shoreline, incredibly dense, it would be like punching a 6-foot alley through that dense vegetation in order to walk down your dock. That's what we're allowing. Now, I'm not saying that that property owner has to keep that densely vegetated buffer, because then we would also say, well, you need to be able to see the lake. And so we're reasonable. You can create a reasonable view, and you can go in and you can remove dead, dying, and diseased things. That's reasonable. And you need access to your dock, and that's reasonable. And then if you have eroding shoreline, you may be removing some vegetation there to install your riprap. So it's not as if it's pickled and you can't do anything. But what I would say today is if you're marketing a densely vegetated property, be careful over promising to a buyer that they can clear it and open up these views. It's going to remain a pretty densely vegetated buffer.
Can I follow up?
Follow up.
I have a follow-up question about the footpath. What can the walkway be made of? For example, it cannot be concrete.
Correct. So it needs to be a permeable surface or semi-permeable surface, meaning that rainwater can find its way through that surface into the ground below. So that can be mulch. We actually do allow gravel within that 6-foot wide path. Typically, it'll be framed in somehow. There'll be edges that prevent that gravel from bleeding outside of 6 feet. We do allow brick paver, concrete paver, again, with cracks between the pavers, which allows for some infiltration. But the minute you have a monolithic surface like asphalt or concrete, that's creating a stormwater runoff problem. Every drop of rain that hits it is running somewhere else, and there's no opportunity for penetration. And so that's why we don't allow impervious surface.
When was that made a regulation? What year? Do you know?
Well, it's been in the Shoreline Management Plan since 2003. I joined the company in 2015, and we've enforced it that way as long as I've been there. I'm not sure if there were earlier kind of generations that maybe it was overlooked, or
Yeah.
not sure. If you have concrete or asphalt and it's pre-2003 and we've documented it's there under these grandfather conditions, we're not going to require you to remove it, but you can't expand it or add to it. Let me jump over here if you don't mind for a question.
So does that material include wood decking? Wood?
Thank you. The question is, can you have wood decking as part of your walkway? And yet, yes, you can, because you might have steps or stairs along the way. Right.
When you get a permit for a dock, I've heard, and I don't know if this is true or not, that you're basically 50 feet from the shoreline is considered. And then you see occasionally somebody who's got the red buoys, and that can't be more than 50 feet. And I'm assuming that has to be permitted as well.
Right. So red buoys, swim buoys are not allowed.
Oh,
They're not allowed. So let me go back to this term of occupancy and use. With your dock, you are excerpting from the public realm a limited space that's now private realm. When you install swim buoys, you're throwing your arms around water that says, I'm the only one using this. You all can't use it. That's occupying and using, which would go well beyond what the S&P allows from a square footage standpoint to do. So you're not really supposed to
so
have.
all of those swim buoys out there are not legal or supposed to be there.
Correct.
I don't know where the 50-foot came from, but somebody told me.
Well, there's some Department of Wildlife Resources, Coast Guard rules about no wake. And I believe that is within 50 feet of docks. You're not allowed to cast wake within 50 feet of docks. And maybe where that comes in. Okay. Let me talk about the status of property program. First of all, I hope most of you are familiar with this program, requesting a status of property report. Okay. I'm going to call it a service that we offer to you. It may not feel like a service, but it's a service. So this is not getting a permit from Appalachian. This is like a wellness check. So I'm a seller of a property, and before I put my property on the market, I want to make sure that it's healthy, because I'm sure that the buyers don't want to inherit any problems from Appalachian Power. So Appalachian, would you please do a full workup on my property? A wellness check. Can you research your files and come out and do an inspection and write me a report that tells me what the status of health is for my property? And what every property owner is hoping for is a clean bill of health. Okay. Yes, here are the permits we've issued in the past. We've inspected. You're fully compliant with all of your permits. Great. Thank you for doing that. Please make sure when you sell your property that these permits get transferred to the next owners. So that would be a very good status report. When we first started doing this, and I think we've been doing this for at least 10 years now, but really the modern era of status reports probably goes back 5, 6, or 7. Well, since Nick Sink started doing it. That's where most of you will know Nick from. He processes most of our status reports. When we first started doing it, the rate of compliance was 10 to 20%. So if we did this wellness check, we had 80% unhealthy. We would write reports that say, I'm sorry, we cannot assign your permits to the next buyer, to the buyer, because these are problems that have come up in, we issued you a permit in 2008, and you must have done something between 2008 and now that's created a compliance problem. And that must be resolved before we can assign these permits to the new owner. And that was about an 80% rate at that time. And what that creates is a loop. That property owner trying to get to closing, knowing that the buyer is saying, before I buy this, you're gonna have to fix these problems. You have a property owner scrambling to try to get the permits it takes to correct the problem. So that was feeding itself and creating this volume of permit activity. So we've been really trying to educate on that. And I think, Nick, you're just the best at this. I really appreciate everything you do. I'm sure you all enjoy working with Nick. That number is no worse than 50-50 right now. I mean, I'd say that at least probably about 50% of the reports we write, we're happy to say, everything checked out, you're in compliance. Please let the property owner know that after they sell the property that the new owner's got to get the permits transferred to their name. Have a nice day. That's a remarkable turnaround. The ones that are not in compliance tend to be very old permits. A lot of time has lapsed between, when we issued the first permits, maybe 10, 15 years ago. But kind of the modern era of permitting, our compliance rate's really good.
Do you charge for those status property reports?
We do not. We do not. In fact, we don't charge for any of our permits. The courthouses charge to record permits at the courthouse. So that's why checks are made payable to the clerk of court and not to us. So we're kind of a pass-through. We take your check to the courthouse to record your documents, but it's not an Appalachian fee. I want to make sure all of you know how to submit a status property report. And I'm going to see if I can get to a website here. Can't see it.
Jan, help him. I want to get out of Zoom.
Okay. It's not sharing on the screen. I apologize. smithmountainproject.com.
You need to stop sharing and reshare.
Yeah, you have to.
That's probably what it is.
New
So
share.
just stop the share at the top and then reshare. There you go.
Okay, this is Appalachian Power's website for the Smith Mountain Project. Again, tomato, tomato, potato, potato, Smith Mountain Project, right? Here under Shorelines, request status of property report. And this is a portal that will just kind of walk you through the process of applying for this. Tell us which lake you're associated with, Smith Mountain or Leesville. Give us information about the property. Tell us who you are. Are you the owner? Are you the realtor representing the owner? It's going to ask you questions about, is the property listed for sale? Is there a closing date? We're collecting all this information, one, so that we can go do our research, but also so that we can schedule the timing of when we do our work. We're really trying to help you meet your closing schedules. So it's really, really helpful if you'll request the service very early on. Ideally is before, as soon as you list the property for sale, but certainly don't wait till you're under contract and closing is pending to request the service. Try to get this to us as early as possible. We receive an email, and then you, when you submit this request, are going to receive a confirmation email to know that we got your request and we're working on it. And yeah, I'll say this throughout the pandemic. When we first went to work from home in March of 2020, I was worried that the work was going to dry up. I thought, who's going to show their home in the middle of a pandemic and invite strangers in?
Yeah.
And by May of 2020, the market was red hot, which was great. This was people moving here from cities, realizing they could telework, digital nomad, people who decided just to retire early. They realized what a good value it is at Smith Mountain Lake. Yeah, so rough numbers, let's say the market doubled and our efficiency at Appalachian was cut in half because we were one hand tied behind our back trying to work. Nick's first day on the job was March 15, 2020. Literally, the day that everybody else was going home was the day he was coming in to start the job. So in Nick's first year doing status property reports, whereas in previous years we'd averaged 250, maybe 300 a year, his first year he processed over 500 reports. And has been at that level, pretty close to that level ever since. Working hard.
We have more to do.
Yeah, real quick, another plug though is we have probably missed some closings. So you may have had the experience that you weren't able to get to the closing, you didn't get the report from Appalachian in time. But I hope you would all agree that that's been very rare, and we have been able to deliver those results in advance of closings in almost every case. We really work hard to do that. Let me get the Zoom question.
Laura?
Okay, I've got a couple of questions for you. The first one, why is a survey required for the status report after the inspection on the site has been done?
Okay, so it's not required for the status report. If the status report uncovered a compliance issue that therefore requires permitting in order to rectify that issue, then that new permit is the thing requiring the survey. So for example, if someone had modified their dock without a permit, originally it was approved as a 2-slip dock, and we come out to inspect it, and it's a 2-slip dock with 2 PWC ramps attached to it, then that's a modification. And our answer to that property owner is you can either remove those PWC ramps and return it to its permitted condition, or if you want to keep those ramps, then you're going to need a new permit in order to get them, and that's going to require a survey.
Thank you.
Quickly.
They may be asking about the new language in our status of property reports where it says this was prepared without the benefit of an as-built
Okay.
survey.
Thank you. Nick is referring to some new language that we've implemented in recent months that essentially says, it's a disclaimer. It says, when we did this status property report, we didn't have the benefit of the survey. So to the extent that we're telling you no vegetation was cut below the 800, that's as best as we can tell where the 800 is. But in the future, if it came back and a survey was presented to us and it showed that it was in a wildly different place and it turns out vegetation was cut, it's kind of our way of saying, well, we would reserve the right to ask you to mitigate for that. I don't think that's going to happen very often, but I think we had a case recently where there was a feature in someone's yard that we assumed to be above the 800, but when their survey came in, it showed that it was actually below the 800. It wasn't this, Nick, but it would be like a retaining wall or something like that, that we thought was safely above the 800, but their survey came back and showed that it was below. And so we said, well, now that we know, we're going to have to ask you to address it.
Okay,
Thanks,
the next question is a bit long, but it's about a non-compliant dock. And this is a scenario that is not in conjunction with the sale of a property. Can you speak about the compliance letter that a person might get if their dock or shoreline is not in compliance? It doesn't say how long someone has to comply with the items listed in the letter, nor does it state what will happen if they don't comply. So the poser of this question is wondering, what if any time limits the owner might have? And if he or she doesn't comply, what happens to the property owner? Are there fines, etc.?
Well, I'm tempted to ask who asked the question and where they live. And
I'm sorry,
I won't do that.
This is Zoom land, I'm not telling.
I'm teasing, and I appreciate the laughter in the room from that. Appalachian's posture is that we want to work with property owners. And if your momentum is in the direction of compliance, then you're in good graces. I mean, we know it can take time, and we'll work with you to try to solve your problems. It's really when someone is obstinate or refuses or says, I am not working with you, I'm not going to fix that, that we end up saying, well, we're going to have to enforce our shoreline management plan and our legal rights, perhaps even involving our attorneys to try to get your attention to try to address these problems. And that would be very, very rare. So when we send out compliance letters, we will typically say we need to hear from you within a certain amount of time. If it's a significant violation, we'll say, please address this in the next 30 days or 60 days. Even if the physical solution can't be achieved in that amount of time, we're at least hoping to hear from them within that time frame to know that we have their attention and that they're working on in the direction of compliance. So problems tend to work themselves out in this way. if you as a property owner are unwilling to solve your compliance problem now, you are eventually likely to sell your property, and it's going to be a problem then, because you're going to have a buyer who's going to get this report from Appalachian saying, this has been an issue. We told the property owner about it 3 years ago. They haven't addressed it. It's now coming to a head. It's got to be addressed now. And the buyer is going to come back on you and say, why didn't you fix this when you had a chance? So there's kind of an organic way that it probably works itself out over time. You know, we do follow up on violations, and we do follow up on complaints. And when we issue permits, we kind of have an audit program whereby we'll go out after a certain amount of time to check and make sure that the dock was built in accordance with the permit. That's kind of unannounced, you know, we just, you know, but we reserve the right at any time to come out and check and make sure things are in compliance. Yes.
Give me some examples of what non-compliance. What are your top non-compliance?
Thank you. So the question is to kind of preview some of the typical things that we see that create compliance issues. So I'll start with dock structures themselves. Number one, did you build the dock that you said you were going to build? And today in the modern era, they almost always do. We have the benefit of a survey. It locates it in space. We have very good drawings. The contractor is probably using the same set of drawings that were supplied to us. More than likely, that dock is going to be built, you know, the way it was permitted. Very, very old permits that were drawn on graph paper, the likelihood of those docks matching, probably not. Docks require maintenance over time. If your floater is not holding up well and you need to replace your floater, and someone else has a floater and they say, well, I'll just sell you mine or give you mine, and your floater was 8 by 20 and the one you bring in is 12 by 24, and you're thinking a floater is a floater, but that is dimensionally different. And keep in mind, it is occupying and using a greater space. It may still be permissible, but it's not the same space that you were permitted to occupy and use. And that's our mandate. We've got to make sure that at all times you're occupying and using space that you said you're going to be using. So interchanging parts, that can be a compliance issue. Adding new components like PWC lifts, PWC ramps, converting a boat slip into a PWC slip with a hoist for PWCs. That could be, because a lot of people think, you know, what does it matter? You know, it used to be a boat, now it's PWC. Why does that matter? But it is a change. It wasn't addressed in the permit. We would ask that to be re-permitted. Decking in a slip to create seating area where a slip existed, or conversely removing decking to create a new slip. This is interesting. Again, the property owner might think it's the same footprint. What does it matter? I'm not covering up any more of the lake than I used to. But one of the things that we're tracking through our permitting is something we call boating density or traffic. Okay. So a 2-slip dock potentially is creating 2 boat trips during the day, 1 slip dock, 1 boat trip, you know, et cetera. So when you're adding boat slips or contracting boat slips, you're changing the potential boating density for your dock. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's illegal or can't be permitted. It just means it's a change that needs to be reflected in a permit so we can track it. By far, the number one compliance issue is vegetation removal.
Is what?
Vegetation removal. This is largely education that you know, we're trying really, really hard to educate property owners on this, but you know, someone who's just purchased a property and they're excited about their property, they can't wait to have their family come visit that summer. They want to tidy up the lawn, spruce up the lawn. Let's trim this back. Let's cut this out of the way. And it may be years before we get to the property to do our next status of property report when that property sells, and then we see a stump. And then we're wondering, how did that get here? What was removed? And we have to retroactively permit it. That's one of the biggest things I think that happens. Installation of permanent fire pits or patio areas or decking within the project boundary is another common thing. We generally tell people, have all the fun you want to have, just have it up the hill a little bit. Yeah. Try not to do that below the 800.
You mentioned a 2-slip dock. Is there a standard definition on what, how many boats, how many jet skis can be in a 2-slip dock? Because you think if you have 2 slips, you got the boat, and probably 2 jet skis
Right.
or 4 jet skis.
Right. So first question is kind of, what is a slip? What does it take in order to dock a boat? And so for those of you boaters, you need to be able to tie your boat off in more than one direction. If you just pull up next to a dock and you use the cleats on one side of your boat with some lines, you're not really secure. That wave action is going to take, it's fine to visit for the afternoon with your friends, but you're not going to leave your boat in that condition. But when you can tie your boat off in at least two directions with stability, then you're now docked or moored. So U shapes or L shapes are typically what are needed to create the configuration of a slip. So Adam, back to your question. If it's in that configuration and it could house a boat, but they've elected not to house boats there, but to house PWCs in it, we're still going to call it a boat slip because this property owner might be housing PWCs there, but the next one may come in and take that out and put a boat back in there. So we're going to call it a boat slip, even if it's temporarily being used to house PWCs.
Set number, like say, you need to put one boat in it, or you can put two jet skis or four jet skis, because I guess jet ski lifts you need to get 2 or 4.
Right.
If you do it in trade or whatever. So for y'all purposes, is there a set number? Is it 2?
There's not a set number. We don't limit the number of PWCs that you can have, but you have to stay within the square footage of your dock. But you're talking about within a slip, and you're talking about garage style parking.
Yeah,
See that?
What I'm talking about is, my next question is gonna be, why would there be a difference if there's no number on jet skis, the difference between a drop down lift and a pull up lift inside of a boat slip?
Okay, so the first thing is we were listening to our stakeholders when we created the Shoreline Management Plan in 2003. And the agencies that we work with who wanted us to regulate and control boating density, concerned about traffic on the lake. At what point does this lake get so crowded? There's so much development, so many docks and so many boats that it's no fun anymore and it's not safe. Appalachian, how are you going to control for that? Well, one of the ways you're going to control for it is we know where the public access points are and how much traffic they can accommodate. And then these single family docks, you need to limit the number of boats and slips they can have because that's what's contributing. So it's pretty generous if you think about it. We allow on a standard 100-foot shoreline two boats. The compromise we made was an unlimited number of PWCs because at the time it was argued that PWCs are nothing like boats. They don't have the same impact that boats do. This is just runabouts, right? Well, PWCs are very different today than they were in 2003. Some of them are very, very big. But we've maintained that posture that we're not limiting the number of PWCs that you can have per dock. But they are increasing traffic on the lake and density on the lake, but we're not treating them like a boat.
Well, but you can either put a boat in there or you can put jet ski, either way. But my question was more, what's the difference between an actual lift that comes out of the ceiling and a jet ski lift that attaches to inside the slip? So you got your slip.
Right.
You have the normal cradle.
Okay, so Adam, we might need to work offline on this so that if this sounds real specific to a case. Okay,
And we have more questions. in-
okay, so let's work offline on that one because I'm not sure that
It'd be
I'm,
good for everybody to know that, because I never even thought about it until it came up. I mean, I would have thought you
Okay.
could just put your jet skis and slip, been fine. and didn't
right,
matter.
so here's what I think, I'll be real quick on this. Right. Would you agree that there's a difference between a floating dock that has kind of a U-shaped slip, it's just a floater, but no roof overhead, and you're pulling your boat into that floating dock. And when that boat is gone, that water is open, sun shining through it, and then the boat comes back, right? Now put a roof over it, and it's now shaded, okay? And there's no drip line, there's no water in there. So there's a difference there between. So coverage versus non-coverage of water can matter. Right? But then now it might seem like a stretch to say, well, it's under roof. What does it matter if there's a floating platform sitting on top of the water versus a roof? But it is different to aquatic wildlife. I mean, they bump up against that and they see that. So when you're putting the structure floating on the surface of the water, it is fundamentally different from a roof that's 15 feet above that water. There is an impact created by that. So Adam, the situation you're referring to is a boat slip under roof. There used to be a boat there. It would come down from the ceiling, land in the water, cradle goes back up. Now they've simply decided to use that space by sliding a couple of PWC floating ramps in it and parking their PWCs on it. But it's all under roof, it's on the same footprint. But we would say there is a new impact created. You know, it may not seem important to the property owner, but it does affect.
Yeah, but it doesn't affect the amount of foot traffic, and it doesn't, it makes it easier for people to get down.
And we didn't say that we wouldn't permit it. I think we just said a permit is required to do it. It's a change, it's a modification.
And
That's our
we do have some more questions in Zoom land. Laura?
Yes, since we're getting close on time, I have 3 questions. The first is short and simple. If you replace a floater with a smaller floater, can you do that without a permit?
Shades of gray, kind of depends. We are not so picky that we're measuring down to the centimeter. We are, but nor do we have tolerance to allow things to get bigger by, you know, well, it's only, my walkway is only 6 foot 4 inches wide. And I know you said 6 foot, 6 feet's a gracious plenty. And 6'4" we really can't tolerate. If we find a significant difference in a dock and it is less than or smaller, we will, it's case by case, but sometimes we'll make a note in the file and make the property owner aware that the next time you need permitting from us, please make sure to give us accurate drawings that actually reflect the dock. In other words, we can take care of this problem. The next time you affirmatively need a permit from us, we'll make sure that that permit is an accurate reflection of the dock. Nick, is that, again, it's case by case. It depends on the degree of difference, but
Yeah, making the floater smaller may make that area into a slip,
right.
depending on the configuration of the floater. So it'll be case by case. It's hard for us to say, you know,
Okay.
this is what will happen every time because we don't know what that dock
Right.
will look like.
So the answer there is case by case, but there are cases that we wouldn't necessarily require re-permitting, and there are some cases, depending on how the ball bounced and what kind of impacts it created, that we might require permitting.
Thank you. The next question is, are the non-compliance letters public? If so, how would a buyer or a buyer agent research to find out if a property had a non-compliance letter on file?
Okay, so they're not public in the sense that they're recorded anywhere, published in papers, or that we even will send them to, you know, a neighbor who calls in a complaint and says, I want to see everything you've ever done on my neighbor's property. No, we wouldn't do that. We want to make sure that our target audience is the property owner of record at that moment, or any agent representing that property owner. You know, having said that, during the course of a status check, writing a status report, if we feel that having that prior documentation is helpful to their understanding of that report, we'll sometimes attach it. But if that property owner follows up with us and says, hey, in my report, you mentioned all this other stuff, can I please get copies of that? We'll provide copies. I mean, it's kind of on an as requested basis.
Okay, thank you. And my last question, we've had a request for you to address the legacy program.
Great, thank you. So these are for structures and improvements that existed prior to the Shoreline Management Plan in 2003. It's also available to anything that was physically built by September of 2005, for which a building permit had been obtained before 2003. Think of it like this. Sometime in the year 2003, everybody heard Appalachian Power is getting ready to launch the Shoreline Management Plan. Y'all better hustle and do what you want to do now before this thing comes in, right?
Filing did, yeah.
Okay, so a lot of things were built in May, June, July, early August of 2003. It's also true that a lot of people were hustling to try to hire a contractor who said, I'm covered up. I can't get to it before August of 2003. I could build it in 2004. And they went to the county building department and got their building permit in 2003, but they weren't able to build it until 2004 or 2005. We will recognize those structures as being, we don't use the term grandfathered, but that's a term that's helpful to you, grandfathered structures through the legacy program. Another way of thinking about it is planes on a runway waiting for takeoff. If your plane is on the runway, but hadn't been cleared for takeoff yet, but you were there before 2005, you can take off. But if you were still at the terminal and nobody aborted the plane yet, you're not grandfathered. That makes sense. So what do we do through the legacy program? It's voluntary, it's not required, but we think it's highly advisable. If we write a report that says your dock is eligible for a permit under the legacy program, we think it would be a really good idea to get that. If the dock were destroyed, it would allow you to rebuild it. It would document and demonstrate to the buyer that this is all permissible. So it removes any kind of gray area. And it creates that baseline moment in time that everybody knows as of this date, everything was legitimized and official.
Thank you.
We're out of time, but did I have another question?
Yeah, we can take one more over there.
It's very quick. This report request, can that be anyone? Or does it have to be the owner or the owner's agent?
Owner,
The buyer's agent.
owner's agent, buyer, or buyer's agent, but please be advised that we are obligated to send the information to the buyer, to the current owner of record. So if you're representing a buyer, you have to give us valid information for the owner so that in giving you the results, we can give it to the owner too.
Neil, I would like to thank you. I have learned so much. Have you guys learned a lot? Isn't this great? Thank you. He has promised to come back and visit in the future. He will be here for a few minutes to take questions here. Please, again, don't forget your surveys, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thank
We
you.
don't have surveys.
They will be sent to you.
Okay.
Neil,